Hello and welcome to Author Hour. I'm your host, Richard Lyntton, author of North Korea Deception and Hyde Park Deception. Today, I would like to welcome local author Carole Adrienne. Adrienne is a documentary filmmaker and the author of an extraordinary new non-fiction book, Healing a Divided Nation, How the American Civil War Revolutionized Western Medicine. Time magazine recently printed an excerpt from the book, and Carole has given a presentation at the Smithsonian Institution. The book is an unusual and heroic perspective on the Civil War from those who worked to heal the wounds of the sick and injured. Carole, welcome. Lovely to meet you.
You too, Richard. Thank you for having me.
So fantastic. So I sort of want to know, like, who is Carole Adrienne? Because someone who can write this extraordinary piece of nonfiction, I mean, there's so many things, but can you just give us a quick pen picture for those who haven't met you, apart from being an author, that is?
Well, I'm an independent filmmaker, a documentary filmmaker, and for several years I've been working on a 4-part series called Civil War Medicine.
Oh, wow.
So it's 4 one-hour programs. It's been a long process. But then when COVID hit, the studios closed just as we were recording voiceovers, and I got an offer to do a book about the same subject.
Amazing.
So it was much more work than a film.
Really?
Yeah. So I thought when you're in films, you're working with other humans. There's music involved, sound effects. When you're writing a book, you're pretty much locked up with yourself.
Right.
But it was an extraordinary experience.
So is the book kind of a mirror of the documentary film that you are still making?
It is a mirror in some sense, but with a book you really can dive much deeper than you can when you're limited with the time of a film.
Right.
So it was really wonderful to be able to dig even deeper and say things that I can't say in the documentary. Right. So I do like that part of it.
So someone came to you. You didn't have to go out and get an agent or a publisher. They came to you.
Well, I actually did. I applied for an agent, and I thought, let's do a picture book to go along with the film.
Okay.
And he said, no, I see a real book.
Wow. Wow.
So that was really unusual, and it was a pretty blessed experience.
But real quick, you are from Philadelphia originally?
I am, Center City.
Center City, so born and bred, all these
City
years.
girl.
Yeah. And what did you do before you were a documentary filmmaker?
I worked in fashion for a long time.
Right. Wonderful. But you also do all these other things with local archives and museums and, the Mutter Museum I read. Tell me about that connection, because I've always been fascinated by it, like I'm sure most people, about the Mutter Museum.
Oh, the Mutter Museum of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. And when I first started researching Civil War medicine, the director of the museum, who had held that post for all of her adult life, Gretchen Worden, it was an interest of hers, Civil War medicine. So she introduced me to the Society of Civil War Surgeons. Yep. She gave me access to her extensive files. It was really like jumping in deep water, and it was wonderful. And
where is that archive at the museum?
Yes.
So you would just go and spend hours and hours down there researching?
I would.
Wow.
And then, the museum is a part of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, which is really an 18th century institution. And so the college has an amazing library and reading rooms. So I graduated upstairs for just when I needed photographs or images of those doctors. And so, yes, I've spent lots of time in archives.
So that was to help you create the documentary series.
Yes.
And then what about the so what percentage of that material did you use in this book?
I would say close to all of it. It was the foundation that I had so it gave me the story. I did 4 years of research for the documentary before I started really constructing the scripts.
Right.
So by the time I started, I knew who the main players were. I knew what the status of medicine at the time was. But the book really sent me back into archives again to dig deeper into who these people were and what they went through.
So you had all this information at the Mutter Museum, and then how do you decide and have the confidence to, write this, Healing a Divided Nation, how the American Civil War revolutionized Western America? I mean, that is an extraordinary, huge topic to undertake. So when that agent came to you, or the publisher, I can't remember what you said, but how did you, decide how much you would write about? Because it's like you've written about everything almost.
I know. Well, who told you I went at it with confidence?
Right. Well, that's my question.
It felt like, I always felt that the story had been, to use a very old-fashioned word, vouchsafed to me. I stumbled upon the story, which I wasn't expecting. And it wasn't my kind of story at all.
Really?
But it was so big and so important. And I thought, no one else has made a documentary about this.
Right.
And obviously people have written books about it.
Right.
But I think mine is very different in the perspective. So I don't know. I always say it was such a shock to me to be offered the opportunity to do the book.
Yeah.
And then so frightening at the size of the task and I worked 7 days a week for months on it. And every single morning that I sat down at the computer, I prayed first.
Really?
So I always said I didn't do it alone.
And I, I'm a big fan of John Meacham, who many of you will know as the historian, and not, I sort of go to him first. But I mean, this is on that kind of level for me. Like the detail and the presentation. No, I mean, it is incredible. So again, if you are at all interested in history, I'll just say it again, this is just a great gift, a great book for anyone who's interested in history, non-history, American Civil War. And even I noticed, like, you talk about Florence Nightingale, which of course I picked up on because, the British, she was supposed to be
British.
She was British. And she is it true that she was, well, they say she kind of started nursing, right?
Professional nursing.
Right.
Yes.
So my question is, was she, is that true? Is that just the kind of British fairy tale, knowing what you know now about the American Civil War and how the women, you talk about the women and African American women also. I'm just curious, is that a sort of little bit of a fairy story, or is it true that, Florence Nightingale started it all?
Very true.
Oh, it is? Okay.
Florence Nightingale was unusual. She had a liberal and expansive education provided by her family.
Okay.
And she had always really been drawn to a healing kind of service.
Right.
And she had trained with some people in Germany, but when the war in Crimea broke out, and she heard about what terrible circumstances existed there. Mm-hmm. And she went to the Crimea. This is at a time when women really did not venture too far from the home, and nor were they welcomed to do it. But when she got there and she saw the state of the hospitals and the filth and the people in desperate need, and she knew her moment had come, and she jumped on it, and she got it cleaned up. I mean, she recruited other women in the area to help, and she trained them. And she also wrote a book called Notes on Nursing, which is still in print and is regarded as a classic.
Is there a picture of that in the book? Is there an illustration of it? There was one.
There's a picture of Florence, but not the book.
Okay, there's another sort of guidebook to nursing, an old, centuries old. I thought it was fascinating. But sorry, go on.
But no, it was the real deal. I mean, she started a school of nursing in London, which was the first professional training of women to do nursing. It had always been a man's task, and it was never regarded as a lofty aspiration by any means.
And I read that the word nurse, originally, at least in the American context, was originally a nurse was simply a soldier who had been wounded and just happened to be around to help the doctors, right? So you just talk to us a little bit about how that happened in the American Civil War, and how then how were the ladies and the women introduced? Because as you write about in the book, ladies were ladies in those days, right? So how did that all sort of, transform, as it were?
it was really aggressive action on the part of women.
Okay.
Women saw, all the men were really called into the war effort. And women felt that this was not just a man's war, this was a woman's war. And they really came aggressively against terrible barriers, real gender bias. There's one story about 40 Confederate women who, after the Battle of Shiloh, traveled to the hospitals where they were bringing these hundreds and then thousands of wounded. And they were turned away from the first hospital in Tennessee where they tried to help. And the director of the hospital said, no more women or flies will be admitted. So they moved on to the next hospital. So women really, they were just assertive. They came onto the battlefields. They were not welcomed. But after some time, it was realized they were a huge support.
They were needed.
To the effort. They were.
And on both sides, is that the way you just described it? Did that happen on both sides?
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Right. That was pretty northern and southern. The women were not regarded as professionals.
Right.
Or likely to be.
There's a quote here from one of the pieces of praise. Alongside this technical metamorphosis, a stunning cultural shift occurred wherein women and Black Americans achieved new prominence that would have been impossible without war. Can you just talk a little bit more about what he means in that comment?
I think when desperate circumstances occur, that new means of relief are allowed, if not welcomed. Mm-hmm. And things were so bad. When you think the Civil War, we're talking about 1 million casualties. We are talking about more casualties than World War I, World War II, and Vietnam combined. Wow. Huge, huge. So hundreds of thousands at a time sometimes. And it came to a point where if you're going to help, come help. Yeah. And I think it was, people had a difficult time allowing African Americans who were not permitted to attain medical educations in America at the time. A lot of the African American doctors who served earned their degrees in Canada.
Wow.
So it was kind of like, okay, here's what we've got to do. And not only do we have all these white wounded, we have all these Black wounded. And so we're going to allow the Black physicians in. We're going to allow the Black nurses. Some of the first nurses to serve on a Union hospital ship were escaped slaves.
Wow. Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah.
Really, really amazing. And then what, when I look at, when I was in the Bosnia War and when I see like these, the way bodies are treated, the way dead soldiers are treated, and then in the Ukrainian war, the way the Russians are just leaving their dead on the sides of the street. I mean, I hadn't really thought about it. And then, reading your book made me think about it again. But how and why do you think America began to sort of treat bodies and sick and injured in a more honorable way? Do you have any thoughts on how that kind of happened as you were writing the book?
It brought out something in people. Well, Gettysburg, where there were more than 50,000 casualties. Crazy. And when the Confederates retreated, there were 5,000 wounded Confederates left on the field. Wow. And so the Union medical personnel treated them.
Oh, wow.
And I think you find instances all throughout my research in the doctors' memoirs, in their notes, that it was just, I don't know, humans who couldn't turn their backs on other humans. Right. Right. It brought out a compassion and then a passion for taking care of our own, right, whether they were Northern or Southern.
Right. What else surprised you when you started, researching this book? Like, what other things did you discover that, maybe you hadn't picked up on your documentary, but you sort of discovered in the course of writing the book?
I think one thing that hit me strongly in my initial research for the documentary, and even more powerfully with the book, was the heroism. Right. Of everyday people, yeah, of people who were not doctors, who were not trained medics in any way, and many of whom had never even done volunteer work. Yeah. And this was 4 years of unrelenting violence and disease. Right. And that people who, I think I described it as working through a fog of grief. Virtually every family in the country, Northern and Southern, was affected by this and had lost at least someone.
Yeah.
And that these people didn't turn their backs on it, that they worked for more than 24 hours at a time in operating spaces, that they brought food, that they gave everything that they had to restore these people who had been so broken. And I think it's heroism on a remarkable scale. And it's funny, I looked at something this morning and I got a little teared up about it when I thought, this is people walking into darkness of which they had no experience, and doing every possible thing that they could. We taught Clara Barton, who's another famous woman who she gets referred to as a nurse, but she thought of herself as a relief worker. They really didn't want women going onto the field to attend the wounded, but Clara was like, she was on the field helping a wounded man, and a bullet went through her sleeve and killed the patient. And kept going, moved on to the next.
Wow.
So I think the heroism, which really unadorned, something just from the heart or what makes us human is.
I just remember in Bosnia, when I was in Bosnia, and the besieged Sarajevo, 1,500 shells a day landing. And by the way, Bosnia, to be honest, was nothing compared to what is going on in Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine is Bosnia on steroids kind of thing. But I just remember thinking, like two things always came to me. Like it's as you say, in the midst of war and suffering, how amazing people can be, and how kind and generous. So it's like the very best and the very worst of mankind all in one gets intensified in a war zone, right? And what you're describing is pretty much the same thing again. But I just remember, people would have like 1 cup of sugar left, and they would give me, the Western journalist or the Western soldier, because I was both there, they would say, have a spoonful of sugar with your tea. And that lone thing used to just blow me away, because I'm like, geez, if I was them, I don't think I'd be giving my last spoonful of sugar to this guy, right? I'd be saving it for myself, because he can just go back to his hotel. So, I mean, I guess it just sort of repeats itself. And I have to ask you, what do you make of what you're seeing on the TV at the moment in Ukraine? Because I sort of think of it as, I thought we'd finished all this stuff, like the war in Europe. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't wars elsewhere in the world, of course there are, but all I'm saying is, I'm just, having lived in Russia, I studied Russian, and having spent time in Russia and having been in the Bosnia War and the Gulf War, I'm just like blown away by what I see and how just utterly crazy it is. But what do you make of it? Because it must bring back sort of memories of writing the book and seeing the sick and wounded. What are your thoughts on the Ukraine thing?
The Ukraine thing, every time it comes up on the news, there's a photograph reproduced in the book. I believe it's after Antietam. And there are bodies laid out in a long line. And it just makes me think of that. It's just lines of slaughtered humans. And on the other side, it makes me think of, there are a lot of stories about units getting captured, regiments, during the Civil War. And when they got to the medical tents, a lot of times the Northern and Southern doctors would negotiate. So the doctors who were getting captured would give the capturing forces what they needed to attend to their wounded and keep some for themselves. Wow. I mean, these little moments of humanity, of light. Right, yeah. I mean, it is horrendous. Going back to the writing of the book again, because I thought it was interesting what you said at the start about, the difference for you between writing a book and making a film. Because I always think you have to be kind of much more selfish as a writer, because it's really is you all day long
doing your thing, you're doing writing, drafting, editing. Whereas as a filmmaker and as an actor, I'm speaking of as well, it's so much more collaborative. So tell us more how you got around that. I mean, how long did it take you to write this book?
The basic part of it was completed in 10 weeks, 7
Only
days
10
a week.
Weeks. Wow.
Yes.
7 days a week.
7 days a week.
So how many hours a day?
And then I guess between 8 and 14.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
And then after that, there were about 3 months of more 7-day weeks with the edits.
So no one saw it for the first 10 weeks, because I find this really fascinating because I write every day, so I'm always fascinated by habits of other writers. So my question to you is, how on earth did you manage to work for 8 to 10 hours? Because I find after 2 or 3 hours of say drafting a new chapter, not editing, but just writing a new chapter, or maybe say editing the second draft of a chapter, I find 2 to 3 hours, my brain is like frazzled. I just can't do anymore. So what kind of work are you saying you did for 8 to 10 hours? Because I find that kind of extraordinary. I mean, was it all writing? Or when you say that, do you mean it was like researching, reading, doing the next bit?
And I was driven by fear.
Okay.
I had a deadline, and I thought, I don't want to lose this opportunity. I always think of that Eminem song, "Lose Yourself" in the music, moment. And I thought, this is my opportunity with this book. And so it was largely driven by fear.
Okay.
But
so wait, and who set the deadline? The publisher?
Yes.
But what would happen if you didn't? What would happen if you didn't hit the deadline? They weren't going to pull it completely, were they?
Well,
you didn't know. You didn't want to find out.
I did not want to find out. You're correct.
So I wonder.
Let's not push that line.
I know authors, and they say, "Oh, I'm on deadline," and then a romantic novelist I know in England used to say, "Oh, I missed my deadline." And so, because she's written, I don't know, five or six books, so she doesn't really care anymore about a deadline. So I'm sort of curious about that pressure too. But I mean, so anyway, so I just find that extraordinary. What was that like, being that intense for 10 weeks? I mean, was it, looking back, really enjoyable, or was it just pure sort of torture and hell?
Torture and hell.
Okay.
I was very surprised at some points, like when I went back and would read something that I had written a few weeks before, I was like, oh, it held my interest, or, it flowed, and I'm a brutal, I didn't know the publishing process. So I thought, well, at some point, somebody's going to come along and say, let me see what you've done, and here, do this differently, and arrange it. And no one did.
So wait a minute. Okay, so that's fascinating. So wait. So you send that first draft in, and so what were you then surprised? So you're saying you were surprised that they didn't come back with more changes? It was more sort of grammar and spelling or whatever.
Punctuation.
Right.
That first edit that came back to me about a week after I had sent it, and it was like 3,000 commas. I mean, it was all...
Who is the publisher again? Tell everyone.
Pegasus Books, which is an imprint of Simon & Schuster.
Absolutely huge.
Yeah,
congratulations
wonderful.
Again. So I want to know, when they sent you that first draft back, because this is a show about writing, so what does it look like? Is it literally like, is it someone just handwritten on a page, or is it like, in the margin with the comments, and you have to agree or disagree? How did that process work?
That was a good description of it. It was online, and so there was a column. Yep. So there would be an indication that there should be a comma here, and then I would have to okay it on the side. So I know, like when you do a series, like if you say red, comma, blue, comma, and green. Okay. So some editors say red, comma, blue, and green, no comma, but they were comma people.
Right.
So, but it went through. I think I lost count at 7 edits, but I kept expecting
7. Whoa. Okay,
it was more than 7.
So that's fascinating. Okay, so then because again, this is the real, what I call, this is the big boy world, right? This is Simon and Schuster, Pegasus.
This is New York
So this
suits.
is, right, so this is how it works. So there were 7, so this went back and forth 7 times.
More than.
Wow.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
And none of them were content. I mean, it was crazy. Like they call something double stacking. If you have 2 lines of text and both lines end in a word that ends in A, that's called double stacking.
So you got to change it.
So, well, they do. I mean, they're going to indicate, I have no idea what that particular process is, but it was things, they were so meticulous. I really learned a lot, to be honest, from those editors, those copy editors.
Right.
But they never challenged me on content.
Okay.
So I was really surprised. And
do you think that was because this is is that more a non-fiction thing, I wonder? The content thing? Because I'm surprised when you say that. I mean, to have just kind of, spellings and typos and formatting seems pretty good to me, even though that did go back and forth 7 times. But do you happen to know, was it just, maybe you're just a fantastic writer?
That's what I was hoping. I thought, wow, maybe they're, when I sent it in the first time, I was hoping they'd say, we've never seen such clean copy. And then the 3,000 commas, cured me of that thought.
Right.
But I don't know. I tried really hard to keep a storyline that flowed.
One thing I always think must be very hard when you write non-fiction like this is, and because I did a lot of research when I did my first spy novels, and first of all, non-fiction, there's like usually tons of it to get through, and it's just list after list of stuff that happened. This happened and this. So how do you, if you did, you may not have thought this, but I always think, how do you, as a non-fiction writer, make it, like you just said, more of a story and readable? Because otherwise it's just fact after fact after fact. Did you come across that thinking?
I did. And I know that I had never been crazy about history books, largely because it was fact.
Right.
And I thought, as humans, just as an artist, we like being told stories and we like looking at pictures. And so I told myself as I went through, tell the story. Mm-hmm. And so many times people are mentioned in brief, like a Florence Nightingale or a Clara Barton. And I thought, no, tell their story. Like, what would they want known about their story?
Interesting.
And that kind of, I think I enjoyed that part of it, like digging deeper.
Right.
And also like other Civil War aficionados I know who really have far more experience than I in the field, the Society of Civil War Surgeons, a lot of curators and things, and said, wow, I learned things I didn't know. And I thought that was like the best thing I could possibly hear.
Yeah.
So I think I think it was the notion of telling it as a story.
And what, real quick, because we only got a couple of minutes, so I always save the compelling questions till last. But what impressions or surprises have you had as you have now published your book and given it to the world? I mean, you touched on it just then, but are there any other kind of amazing things that have happened since you've sort of put this into the world for people to read?
I think the 2 things that really made me sit up were that Time Magazine and the Smithsonian thought it was of value. That was pretty eye-opening.
Tell me really briefly about the Time thing. So what happened with them?
Well, first they asked if I would write an original piece for them. And so I thought, okay. And I had an idea, and I submitted the 3 paragraphs they asked for. And then a few weeks later, the publisher said, no, they want to excerpt a chapter.
That's amazing.
Thank you.
And on that auspicious note, that is basically all we have time for. Thank you, Carole Adrienne, for joining us today on Author Hour and sharing your extraordinary and valuable new book. You can find out more about it at www.civilwarrx.com, or of course on Amazon or wherever you purchase your books. And finally, in honor and celebration of the life of Queen Elizabeth II, please enjoy this non-fiction royal and local English series memoir of my great aunt Florence Bramford, who traveled the world on royal tours under 2 Queen Elizabeths. From Cottage to Palace is the name of book 1. It's a series on Worcestershire and Malvern history and is also available on Amazon and hopefully by the time you see this, Audible. Cheerio, see you next time.